Hi, Rhema. It's week 23, day 2 of our Bible narrative reading plan. Today we come to our end in our time of the book of 2 Samuel. The last 4 chapters of 2 Samuel are part of an epilogue. They are not necessarily in chronological order with what we have already read in the narrative of Samuel. These are things that are added at the end by the writer of the book of Samuel to compile all of these things. He's making a point in including these stories, but our Bible narrative reading plan doesn't include all of the end of 2 Samuel. I want to give you that note just as if you choose to read through the end of the book, you'll see different things included, and it helps to know that they're not all necessarily there in chronological order. They're there to bring the book to an end and for the author of the book to make a point as he's compiling all of this information together. What we do look at in our plan today is 2 Samuel 21, and we see that there's a famine in the land. Again, even the way this begins and how it contrasts with the end of chapter 20 lets us know that this is taking place at a different time. This is from an earlier time in David's reign, but there came to be this time that there was a famine in the land. Now David knows what to do. He calls out to the Lord. He seeks the face of the Lord, and the Lord lets him know there is blood guilt. There's guilt on the house of Saul because he had put the Gibeonites to death. Now, let's go back in our memory to remember who the Gibeonites were. All the way back in the book of Joshua, as Joshua and the children of Israel were conquering the land, there were these people named the Gibeonites who heard of the destruction of Joshua and Israel. They heard how they were conquering their enemies. And you remember they put on old clothes and they carried old food and they did all this stuff to make themselves look like they had come from a very far away land and to come and make a peace treaty with Israel. And Joshua did not consult the Lord, and Joshua entered into a treaty with them. But then he realized soon thereafter that they had tricked him, that they were not from a faraway land, that they were actually enemies of Israel, and that they should have been defeated. But God told him to keep his covenant with them, and Joshua has done that. But somewhere along the way, in a place that we're not told in Scripture, Saul killed some Gibeonites. We're not told how many. We don't know the circumstances of that. But here, in this account, we understand that Israel is having some negative consequences. They are experiencing a famine at this point because of what has happened with the Gibeonites. Now, we get a very interesting story of how David responds to this. He goes to the people and he asks the Gibeonites, in verse 3, "What shall I do for you? How shall I make atonement that you may bless the heritage of the Lord?" Notice he's asking the Gibeonites how to make atonement. This is not the way to do this. This is what David does, but it doesn't mean that this was the way God intended for him to deal with this. So as you read through this chapter and you hear all these different things, and it sounds like a very cultic, sacrificial atonement, that they're trying to make human sacrifices in some way of dealing with these sins, and it sounds very weird because this is not the way the Bible tells us to deal with stuff. But David, for whatever reason, is getting input from the Gibeonites. But notice that the text does not tell us that God approves of all of this. All of these things take place, and then at the end of it, it tells us that God responds to the plea for the land. And God doesn't respond until after these people are buried and after all of this interesting practice is over. And so it's a difficult passage in some ways. We have to keep in mind the fact that just because it's recorded in Scripture doesn't mean that God has approved of what has taken place in that. And so it certainly doesn't mean that this is how we atone for sin. In fact, we get a much better account of what our relationship with God is supposed to look like by reading the psalm for the day in Psalm 26. But also at the end of chapter 21, verses 15 to the end of the chapter, it begins, "There was war again." Now, this sounds like an excerpt from something else that has been written. Perhaps David had written earlier in his life where he's talking about war over and over. There was war, there was war, there was war. Well, here in this passage, he says there was war again between the Philistines and Israel. And this passage tells us how 4 other giants along in the line of Goliath were killed by David's mighty men. Perhaps it's pointing us back to the fact that David carried 5 smooth stones when he fought Goliath. He used one on Goliath. Perhaps the other 4 were pointing us to the fact that these other Philistines would die. So again, all of this stuff in chapter 21 and the rest of the book is an epilogue. It's more information about the life of David, but we're going to keep going in our narrative plan to keep going with the big story of Scripture. Here's a summary of today's reading.
For more information, go to tunemyheart.org.